So, taking a look at the week 6 study questions, this is the first Fido reading. Number 1, what is the dramatic context of this dialogue? It's pretty important, I think, for appreciation of what's going on, to realize that the background here is that Socrates is in prison and he's been convicted of, among other things, corrupting a youth of Athens. And this is the day that the death sentence will be carried out, where he'll be drinking the hemlock. It's important because obviously it has makes this great personal connection between the philosophical theme of the dialogue and the personal circumstances of the people there. You have to imagine any Platonic dialogue, not any, but most, taking place in a kind of a crowd, in a small crowd, but Socrates is speaking to several people, and there's several more looking on. He's got a bunch of friends there with him. And he knows that at the end of this conversation, he will die, and they know it too. So, number 2, what is Socrates' basic definition of death? How does this definition contrast with that of Epicurus? We have to read the dialogue to find that, obviously. And what you'll see is that when he actually begins, this is well into it, not at the very beginning of the dialogue, but when he actually begins to address in a serious way the question about whether the soul really does live on in some way, exist in some way after the death of the body, he defines death as a separation of soul and body. That's his starting point. Obviously, this is a great difference with the way that Epicurus begins, with the idea that death is the privation of all awareness. They are two, I would say, entirely different, entirely incompatible ways of approaching the subject. What is the most important thing that Socrates has to prove in this dialogue? I hope you have a sense of that. The most important thing that he has to prove is the question that is naturally raised after he defines death, and that is, can the soul exist without the body? So we could say, of course, that the most important question is whether the soul is immortal, whether there's life after death. There's many ways of putting it, but I think the most helpful way of putting it, because it gets us into the philosophical problem, which I think is at the center of the dialogue, which is this relation between soul and body, and whether or not the soul can exist without body. That's really, because if he can establish that, then he can establish that, that the soul is immortal. Number 4, why does Socrates think the philosopher should welcome death? Well, this is a complicated question, I think. The simple answer is because he believes that true knowledge is only possible after death. That is, after the soul has been liberated from, is one way of characterizing that separation, but once the soul is separated from the body, that's the simple answer. The hard part is understanding what the heck that could possibly mean, right? I mean, we can say these things. Oh yeah, that's what he says, but why would he say it? That's what it really means. I mean, to understand why he thinks the philosopher should welcome death, you have to have some grasp of Plato's theory of knowledge, which is not so easy, right? But it's quite clear that he does not believe that sense experience ever gives us true knowledge. Sense experience, the kind of experiences we have as living creatures, as organisms, through our senses, Socrates indicates is a barrier to knowledge. And it's only when the soul is liberated from those barriers of the senses, that it can see reality clearly. And reality is ideas. A reality is intellectual reality. Reality is what he calls the form. Number 5, what does Socrates mean by absolute? That is, absolute beauty, absolute justice, absolute equality, etc. Well, he means the form, the eidos. The heart of Platonism is this idea of the ideas, This idea that aside from the many beautiful things or the many just things or the many equal things, there is beauty itself, justice itself, equality itself. These are pure ideas, what we call in translation forms. It's I believe a translation of the Greek eidos. And I think the important thing is to remember that these are purely intellectual things. They're not things that can be seen or heard or touched. They are the thinkable things, the intelligible things, the absolute ideas in the sense of being ideas. So the absolute beauty would be beauty in itself. The idea of beauty that is reflected in every single beautiful thing, but is not any single beautiful thing, you might say. It's a tough point, but 6, explain why it is an important point in the argument for the immortality of the soul that the soul is like the forms, the absolute. Well, the idea is that intellectual things, concepts like mathematical concepts, or in his belief, the forms, that they are timeless and eternal. They have no beginning and no end. And so the very idea of death does not apply to the forms. Like a beautiful thing can be destroyed, but the idea, the form of beauty cannot be destroyed. It's something else. It's something that death doesn't apply to it. So if the soul or intellect or mind, if we get more expansive in our ideas of what he means by soul, if the soul is what enables us to know the forms, and it must be enough like them to know them, and therefore it too is eternal because it's like them. But that's it's a pretty rough argument, but you can see where he's going. Number 8, number 7, explain Simius's idea that the relationship between soul and body is like that between harmony and lyre. Well, that's a pretty darn important part of the dialogue. That's what divides the dialogue in half. I would say everything that comes after is really an attempt to overcome this idea. And the other idea from Siebes, his other objection. But it's incredibly important. And I think its importance for this class transcends the reading of the Phaedo, and it applies to certainly what we'll read next week, the Paul Landsberg essay, The Experience of Death. And perhaps other things too, the idea of whether or not soul or mind or consciousness is entirely dependent upon the physical body, which is certainly what Simius is saying, that we could say that soul and body certainly are two distinct things. But he says, well, it would seem that soul is entirely dependent upon body, just as the harmony produced by a musical instrument exists as something different from the musical instrument, but is entirely dependent upon the musical instrument, for its being. It's a great challenge. So yeah, why is Simius's idea of soul as harmony such a challenge to the idea of the soul as immortal? Well, I mean, obviously, if the soul is dependent upon body, and body clearly dies, then the soul dies too. And that would completely undermine what Socrates apparently is trying to establish in this dialogue, that is the immortality of the soul. Completely incompatible.